The earth had a particular way of cracking in a drought year, not all at once, but slowly, the way a good intention comes apart under too much pressure. By late summer of 1874, the ground across the southeastern Nebraska claim had fractured into a mosaic of pale, thirsty plates, each one curled at the edges as if trying to peel itself free of the dust beneath. The sky had been the same hard, whitened blue for so long that clouds felt like a rumor from some other country. He stood at the edge of what had been the kitchen garden and pressed the toe of his boot against a clod of earth. It dissolved into powder. She was beside him, not quite touching, arms folded across her chest in the way she had when she was thinking, rather than worrying, though the two had grown harder to tell apart this season. She'd kept a record in the back of her household ledger, what went in, what came up, what the heat took back. The columns on the right side of the page were thin. The bean rows had given up in July. The squash had made 3 fruits between them, small and pale. The corn stood at knee height and would go no further. The shallow creek on the eastern edge of the property was running brown and slow, edged with a white mineral crust that made the water bitter enough to taste even at a distance. 160 acres of land, deeded and filed under the Homestead Act, and most of it was just waiting for something to change or someone to give up. They were not, either of them, inclined toward giving up. He had been a carpenter before they came west, a man who understood load-bearing walls, the distribution of weight, which joints would hold and which would fail under pressure. He brought that habit of assessment to the land now, looking at it the way he once looked at a frame being raised, not as what it was, but as what it could carry. She had spent 3 years as a schoolteacher's assistant before they married, and she had learned that patience and a methodical eye were more useful than inspiration in the long run. She kept the ledger, she kept the calendar, she kept count. Together they had tallied this evening what remained: a half bushel of dried beans, a small cache of salt pork, a cord of cut wood for the coming cold, and $1.40 in coin, the last physical evidence of a life that had started with more promise than this. He turned the coins over in his palm once, then closed his hand. She didn't ask what he was thinking. After 2 years on this claim and 4 years of marriage, she already knew the shape of his silences. This one was not defeat. It was the particular quiet of a man who has looked at every option available and decided he is not finished looking. There had to be something they had missed. The auction at Caldwell Crossing was held on the 2nd Thursday of each month, and they walked the 4 miles in the early morning cool before the heat could claim the road. She carried the empty market basket. He carried the coins in his front pocket, where he could feel their small weight with each step. The livestock pens ran along the east side of the feedlot, and the smell of the place reached them before the sound did. Hay and hide, and the particular sharpness of animals kept too close together. Most of what sold that morning moved quickly. 2 hogs, a pair of draft horses with good knees, a crate of laying hens that drew serious bidding from 3 different farm wives. He watched the prices and said nothing. She watched the prices and did the same arithmetic in her head and reached the same conclusion. Nothing here was within reach. Then, near the end of the morning, a seller brought forward a wooden crate with slat sides, and something inside it shifted and muttered in low, uncertain tones. 11 ducks, the seller announced, with the flat delivery of a man who expected no celebration. Mixed breed, blind, the lot of them, born that way or near enough it made no difference. Good for nothing, he'd been able to determine. He'd take $1.40 for the crate, birds included, and count himself generous for the offer. The laughter came quickly, the way it always does when a crowd has been standing in the sun too long and needs somewhere to put its restlessness. Someone near the back said something she couldn't hear, but the response it earned was not kind. The seller shrugged. He was past embarrassment. She stepped closer to the crate. The ducks moved as she approached, not in panic, but in a slow, deliberate reorientation, their bills tilting, their heads canting sideways in that particular way of creatures that have learned to read the world through means other than sight. They were not frantic, they were attending. There was something careful in the way they held themselves, something that looked, to her schoolteacher's eye, less like blindness and more like a different kind of focus entirely. She stood there for a long moment. Then she turned and found him at her shoulder, because after 4 years of marriage he had already read the angle of her back. She said, quietly, that she believed something deliberate lived in those birds, that whatever they were listening to, it was not nothing. He looked at the crate. He looked at the cellar. He looked at the coins he already had in his palm, as if he had known without deciding that this was where the morning was headed. The crowd had gone back to its own business. No one watched them count out every cent they had, $1.40 exact, and carry the crate between them toward the road home, the ducks shifting their weight in the slow, considered way of things that know exactly where they are going. They set the crate down in the yard and unlatched the front panel without ceremony, stepping back to give the birds whatever space they needed. There was a brief stillness, the kind that precedes something, and then the first duck stepped out onto the packed dirt as though it had been here before. The others followed in their own time. No rushing, no panic. Each one paused at the threshold of the crate and seemed to take a reading, head tilted, bill lifted slightly, the whole body quieted into a kind of instrument. Then they moved, not in a cluster, not in the mindless scatter of spooked fowl, but outward, in slow, branching arcs, each bird tracing its own particular radius from the point of release. She had taught herself not to expect too much of new things. That had been the school teacher's discipline. Watch first, interpret after. So she stood with her arms loose at her sides and watched, and she did not say what she was already beginning to think. He crouched down, not for any practical reason, just to be closer to the level of what was happening. The ducks moved with a deliberateness that was almost meditative. When one pressed its bill to the ground, it was not frantic pecking, but something slower, a sustained contact, as if tasting the composition of the earth itself. When one paused at the fence line and turned its head, the gesture had in it a quality of consideration. They bumped into obstacles gently and corrected without distress. They communicated in low, conversational mutters that bore no resemblance to alarm. By mid-morning, she had counted that 7 of the 11 had drifted, by varying routes, toward the northwest corner of the pasture. Not together, not led. Each had arrived there separately, by its own private navigation, and settled into the pale, mineral-dusted ground, the way a person settles into a chair they have been looking forward to all day. She did not say anything yet, because the thought was still too young, and she had learned to be careful with young thoughts, the way you are careful with seedlings. Too much handling too soon, and they fail to root. But she watched those 7 birds sitting in the northwest corner, bills pressed to the cracked white earth, and she was quiet in a particular way. The way she was quiet when something had already changed, but she had not yet confirmed it with words. He came to stand beside her at the fence. The afternoon light was angling low and gold across the flat pasture, making long shadows of the ducks, and of the 2 of them leaning on the fence rail together. He said nothing either. He was also watching, but after a while he reached over and rested his hand on top of hers where it gripped the rail, and she turned hers over and held it, and they stood there in that particular kind of silence that is not empty but is instead almost full to the edge. The next morning, all 11 ducks went to the northwest corner and stayed. She had half expected it, in the way you half expect something you are almost afraid to expect, carefully, with one part of yourself held back in reserve. But to see it made real, to stand at the fence in the early gray light, and count them one by one, all 11 settled in that pale, mineral-dusted patch of ground, as though they had been placed there by a deliberate hand, was something different from expecting. It was the difference between reading a word and hearing it spoken aloud in a quiet room. She went inside, and found the small ledger they had been using to track feed costs and the dwindling list of what they owned. She turned to a fresh page at the back. There were several, which was its own kind of small bitterness, and she dated the top of it and wrote the time, which was 20 minutes past 6 in the morning by the small clock on the shelf. Then she wrote, "All 11 birds, northwest corner, bills to ground, weather clear, no wind." He came in from checking the fence line and saw her at the table. He looked at the ledger, then at her. She said she wanted to write it down properly, because she did not want to be the kind of person who sees something and then later doubts she saw it. He sat down across from her and said, "That seemed like sound thinking." Over the next 2 days, she kept the log as carefully as she had once kept attendance records. Morning position, afternoon position, whether any of the birds had wandered elsewhere, and for how long before returning. She noted the precise geography of the patch, roughly 30 feet across, the soil pale almost to white in the center, chalky, with a faint mineral smell she had begun to notice when the wind came from that direction. She noted that the ground there did not crack the same way the surrounding pasture did. The rest of the field fractured in long, jagged lines when the heat bore down. That patch cracked in smaller, tighter patterns, almost circular, like something pressing up from beneath, rather than the surface pulling apart from above. She showed him the log on the second evening, and he read each entry slowly, the way he did when he was building something in his mind before he built it with his hands. He ran his thumb across the page where she had sketched a rough outline of the patch and marked where each bird tended to cluster most densely. The center, always the center. He set the ledger down and looked at the window, which was dark now, the pasture invisible beyond it. She said she knew it was not proof of anything yet. He said he was not sure he needed proof so much as a reason, and that she had given him one. She closed the ledger and set it on the shelf where they could both find it easily, and they finished their supper in the particular quiet of 2 people who have begun, together, to lean in the same direction. He went out to the northwest corner the next morning before the dew had fully lifted, while the air still carried the last thin coolness of night. The ducks had already made their way there, moving in their usual unhurried procession across the dry grass, heads low, bills occasionally touching the earth, as though reading something written there in a language he was only beginning to suspect existed. He stood at the edge of the pale patch and watched them for a time. Then he crouched and pressed his palm flat against the cracked ground. He held it there. The surrounding pasture was already warming, pulling heat from the risen sun the way hardpan does, quickly, evenly, without reservation. But the pale patch beneath his hand was different. Not wet, not soft, just faintly, unmistakably cooler, the way a stone floor feels in the morning, before the day has had its way with it. He pressed harder, as if more pressure would tell him more. It did not, but he stayed crouched there longer than was practical, moving his palm slowly from one cracked section to another, mapping it in the way she mapped things in the ledger. The cooler sensation held through the center of the patch, and faded as he moved outward toward its edges, like a ring drawn around something that did not yet have a name. By midday, the distinction was still there, subtler now, the sun working against it, but present. He checked it 3 times between morning and noon, and each time the answer was the same. That evening he came in and washed his hands and sat down at the table while she poured the coffee, and instead of waiting for supper conversation to find its own way somewhere useful, he told her plainly what he had felt. She sat across from him and listened without interrupting, the way she had always listened, not passively, but with the kind of attention that gathered details and held them. When he finished, she opened the ledger to her notes, and they sat side by side with it, flat between them on the table, her sketched diagram of the patch in the firelight, the duck positions marked in pencil. They talked seriously then, for the first time, about what might be underneath. Not a wish and not a prayer, a genuine reckoning. He had dug foundations before, had worked enough different soils to know that temperature variation at the surface often meant something moving below, even if it moved slowly. Mineral seep, he said, or a vein of clay holding cold, or, and here he said it carefully, giving it no more weight than it deserved yet, water. She said the word back to him quietly, as though testing how it sounded spoken aloud in that particular room. Water. He pulled the ledger closer and drew a rough cross-section in the margin beside her sketch. Guesswork, nothing more. And they stayed at the table until the fire burned low, measuring what they knew against what they could not yet afford to hope. The neighbor arrived on a Tuesday, mid-morning, riding the fence line the way men sometimes did when they were looking for something to report. He pulled his horse up at the gate without dismounting, and sat there watching the ducks. They were on the northwest patch already, arranged in their loose, unhurried cluster, bills working at the cracked pale earth, as though reading something written there for them alone. The neighbor watched for a long moment without speaking. Then he said it was the strangest thing he had seen on any claim in 2 counties, and he did not say it as a compliment. She came out from the cabin and gave him a civil greeting. He asked, with the careful politeness of a man who had already made up his mind, whether the birds were well. She said they were. He glanced at the patch again. He said it looked like they were grieving something. She told him the ducks were settled and the land was their own, and she thanked him for stopping. He tipped his hat and rode back toward the road. 3 days later, the phrase reached them. The Voss flock, praying to the dirt. Someone at the Caldwell Crossing feed store had said it first, and someone had laughed, and after that, it moved the way things move through small prairie towns, quickly and with improvement at each telling. By the time it cycled back to them through a woman who meant well and said so twice, it had acquired details neither of them recognized. There was something in the phrasing that made the ducks seem pathetic and their faith in the birds seem worse. He was repairing the gate latch when she told him. He listened without stopping his work. That evening they did not talk about it immediately. They ate. He washed the dishes, which was not usually his task. She sat with the ledger open, but did not write in it. Eventually he came and stood near the table, and she looked up. He said, "It doesn't change what we saw." She said she knew that. He said, "Doubt someone else planted is still someone else's." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she believed what she had observed. She had written it down for that exact reason, not to remember it, but to have proof that she had seen it before anyone told her what to think. The ducks went to the patch. They went consistently. They went in heat and in overcast and in the cooler hours of morning, when every other instinct ought to have pulled them toward the shade of the fence. That was not prayer. That was pattern. He sat down across from her. They left the ledger open between them, her notes unchanged from the night she had made them, her sketch of the patch still holding its careful accuracy. Outside, the ducks had settled for the night, and the dry northwest corner of the pasture held its silence, indifferent to what Caldwell Crossing thought of it. He picked up the pencil and drew a line straight down. The line he drew was vertical, straight as a plumb bob, and she understood it immediately. Not a question. A decision rendered in pencil on the margin of a page. They slept without much talk. In the morning, he sharpened the spade against the whetstone, while she wrapped cloth around the handle of the post bar to spare her palms. Neither of them announced what they were doing. They simply gathered the tools and walked to the northwest corner together, the ducks threading along behind them as though they had been invited. He broke the first crust of earth with the spade heel. The soil was pale and mineral-dusted on the surface, but below the top inch it darkened to a dense, waxy clay that resisted the blade and rang faintly against the iron. He worked in slow quadrants, loosening a section before prying it free. She shoveled the broken clay into the bucket and walked it clear of the rim, tipping it onto the spoil pile they began to build to the south. Back and forth. The sun climbed. The ducks stood at the edge of the marked ground and waited. By midday, they had reached 18 inches. The clay was uniform and gave nothing away. The second day felt harder than the first, not in the body but in the mind. He was below her line of sight now, working in the hole, and she could hear the rhythmic concussion of the pickaxe, but could not read his expression. She pulled the bucket up by the rope they had rigged over a salvaged post, emptied it, lowered it again. The labor had its own grammar, a sentence that repeated without yet arriving at meaning. On the third day, she began to feel the first real doubt, not as opinion, but as weight, something that settled in the shoulders. She did not speak it. She wrote it instead. That evening, in the margin of the ledger beside her original notes. "Doubt is permitted here," she wrote. "Doubt is not direction." Each dusk, the ducks came and arranged themselves along the rim of the growing pit, their bills pointed downward, sitting in a loose and patient ring. She noticed it the first evening and marked it. She noticed it each evening after, and let the observation stand without comment. There was something in their posture, not agitation, not confusion, that read to her like attendance, as though they were keeping an appointment. By the fourth day, the hole was past 3 feet. The clay had shifted character. It was cooler now, perceptibly so, and had taken on a faint darkening she could not entirely account for by shadow. He said nothing about it in the moment, but when he handed up the bucket, she saw that a small clot of clay on its rim glistened with something that was not sweat and was not dew. She set the bucket down carefully. She called to him. He looked up from the bottom of the hole, and she held out the bucket so he could see. He went back down into the hole that same evening and worked another half-hour until the light failed entirely. She held the lantern at the rim and watched the shadows move across his shoulders. Neither of them spoke about the glistening clay directly, not yet, as though naming it aloud might alter whatever fragile thing had announced itself. She wrote 2 words in the ledger that night, then crossed them out, then wrote them again. "Darker here." Morning came gray and close, a low ceiling of cloud pressing in from the northwest that kept the air unusually cool. She was already at the pit when he arrived with the tools, her hand pressed flat against the eastern wall of the hole. She withdrew it and showed him her palm. Cool. Distinctly, undeniably cool. He dropped in and took up the spade. The clay at this depth had changed its nature entirely. It came away in dense, cohesive slabs, rather than the crumbling dry clods of the upper layers, and its color had deepened from the pale, mineral-dusted gray of the surface to something nearly charcoal. He worked methodically, moving the blade in careful horizontal passes, loading the bucket she lowered on the rope. He did not rush. She had noticed early on that he worked better in silence, and she had learned to match it. So the only sounds were the rhythmic press of the spade, and the soft thud of clay into the bucket, and the bucket's slow rise against the rope. Then the spade hit something that was not clay. It was not stone. It gave slightly, a dark seam, horizontal, running through the wall like a fault line laid by a patient hand. He pressed the blade in again. The resistance yielded. And then, from the floor of the hole, from around the tip of the spade, from no single identifiable place, but from everywhere below him at once, water began to rise. It came quietly. That was what struck him first. No rush, no rupture. It simply arrived, welling up through the dark seam with the unhurried certainty of something that had always been there and had only been waiting for the question to be asked. Clear, cold, steady. He said her name. She was already looking. She had seen the change in his posture before he spoke, the stillness that came over him, the way he planted both hands on the spade, as though steadying himself against something invisible. She knelt at the rim. The water was rising around his boots now, slow and certain. He climbed out without a word and knelt beside her at the edge. They reached in together. The cold of it went straight to the bone, clean cold, living cold, nothing like the brackish warmth of the eastern creek. She cupped her hands, and the water filled them, and ran between her fingers back into the rising pool. He pressed his palms flat against the wet earth at the base, and felt the current moving under his hands, faint and constant as a pulse. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed saying yet. They sat at the edge until the light went gray, watching the pool find its own level. By the time they walked back to the cabin, the water had risen to fill the pit nearly to the brim, spilling a thin, bright thread along the low ground toward the garden plot, as though it already knew the way. He could not sleep. He lay on his back in the dark and listened to her breathing and thought about the geometry of it, the berm they would need, the angle of the overflow channel, how many feet of sod it would take to hold a pond wall against a hard rain. Carpenter's arithmetic, the kind of thinking that had always settled him. By the time the sky paled, he had most of it worked out. The week that followed did not feel like labor in the way the digging had. The digging had been an act of faith, uncertain and heavy. This was something else, purposeful and almost glad. The work of people who now knew what they were building toward. They widened the pit by 2 feet, then 3, working from opposite sides with spade and pickaxe, smoothing the walls, sloping the floor, so the water would pool evenly rather than collect in corners. He cut sod in long, flat bricks from the pasture, and she stacked them along the northern and western edges, packing wet clay between the courses. The berm rose slowly, solid and low, shaped to catch the overflow and direct it rather than lose it to the flat ground. The overflow itself, they did not fight. They followed it. He walked the natural grade with a stick laid flat, reading the fall of the land the way he had once read a level beam across rough lumber. She came behind him with a spade, deepening the line wherever it wandered too shallow, cutting a clean-sided channel, no wider than a man's forearm. It ran 40 feet to the garden plot in a gentle curve, ending where the soil was darkest and most cracked from the drought, exactly where it needed to go. By the 4th day, the ducks had moved in entirely. They had been cautious the first morning, tilting their heads at the new sounds the water made, the fill, the ripple, the small percussion of the overflow lip. But by the second evening, they swam without hesitation, navigating by the current's voice, by the soft turbulence of the spring welling up from below. She stood at the berm and watched them, and felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled in a long time. The channel reached the garden on the 5th day, and the ground there darkened in a slow, wide stain. And that evening, they both stood and looked at the wet earth and said nothing, because it seemed important not to interrupt it. She had been thinking about the garden for 3 days before she touched it. Not planning exactly, more like holding it in her mind the way you hold a handful of seed, feeling the weight of what it might become. The channel was cut and running, the water finding the garden plot in its slow, patient way, and now she walked the perimeter of the plot each morning, with her boots leaving prints in the softened earth, reading it the way she had once read a page, line by line, nothing missed. She moved the bean rows first. The original layout had been drawn before they knew about the water, everything spaced for dry land survival, wide and cautious. Now she could afford closeness. She replanted the stakes in tighter rows, running perpendicular to the channel, so the water would fan across the whole width rather than favor one edge. The squash she moved to the far end, where the overflow would pond briefly before draining, giving it the deep soaking it wanted. Along the channel's near bank she pressed in turnip seed and a row of beet crowns salvaged from their last trade at Caldwell Crossing, edging them with flat stones she had carried from the dry creek bed one by one in her apron. It was careful, deliberate work, the kind she had always been good at. While she remade the garden, he built the duck house. He had scavenged the materials over several days, fence posts pulled from the eastern line where the drought had made them pointless, river reeds bundled from the sluggish creek bed and laid in the sun to cure until they rustled like paper. He had no nails to spare, so he notched the posts in the carpenter's way. He still carried in his hands, without having to think about it, the joints tight enough that when he pressed the structure, it did not shift. The thatch he layered from the ridge down, each bundle overlapping the one below, shedding water the way a good coat sheds rain. He set it at the pond's south edge, low to the ground, the entry facing the water. The ducks found it before he finished. They came around the berm in their loose procession, tilting their heads at the new sounds, the reed walls moving faintly in the breeze, the water nearby, and the first one walked directly inside and settled. The others followed by sound alone, by the confident rustling of the one ahead. She was pressing the last beet crown into the earth when she heard the commotion and looked up. The whole flock was in the water. They moved with a sureness that made no sense until it made complete sense, reading the spring's current like a map. And something in that sureness made her laugh. Sudden, unguarded, the kind of laugh that surprised her with its own fullness. He looked over from the duck house and smiled. Word traveled the way it always did on the Nebraska plain, carried by a man going to mill, repeated at a dry goods counter, passed between wives at a well. By the second week of October, people in Caldwell Crossing had heard that the Voss claim had water, not the brackish seep most homesteads relied on this dry year, but clean water, running steady, enough for a pond and a garden that was still green, while everyone else's had gone brown and stiff. The first neighbor came on a Tuesday morning, hat in hand, stopping his wagon at the claim's edge, the way a man does when he isn't certain of his welcome. He had laughed at the auction, not meanly, not with malice. He had simply laughed because everyone else did. Because 11 blind ducks for $1.40 seemed like the kind of purchase a desperate man makes when desperation has finally loosened his good sense. He stood at the berm's edge now and looked at the pond. He looked at the ducks moving across it with their quiet, unhurried certainty. He looked at the kitchen garden, the beet crowns still showing green, the late squash fat along their runners. She was the one who met him. She came from the garden with earth on her hands and said good morning, the way she might have said it to anyone, without weight behind it. He asked, haltingly, whether they had eggs to sell. She told him they had more than they needed, and named a fair price, and he paid it without argument. He came back the following Friday. He brought his wife. After that, they came in ones and twos, quietly, on ordinary errands. A family whose well had gone bitter asked to fill 2 jugs from the spring overflow. She let them, and charged nothing, and told them the channel ran along the north edge of the garden if they wanted to see how it was laid. A woman from the east side of Caldwell Crossing asked about the beet cuttings, and walked away with a wrapped bundle of them under her arm. He watched all of it from the work he kept moving through, mending fence, banking the duck house against the coming cold, and he did not say much about it. But one evening when the last visitors had gone, and she came inside with an empty egg basket and 2 coins in her apron pocket, he looked at her across the table in a way that asked whether she was satisfied with how she had handled it. She set the coins down between them. She said she didn't see any reason to make people feel small for being wrong about something. She had been wrong about things herself. He nodded. Outside, the ducks had gone quiet on the water, settling in for the night with the same unhurried confidence that had marked them from the very first day. The evening came in slowly, the way late autumn evenings do on the flat country, not falling so much as settling, the light going amber, and then the color of old brass, and then something quieter than either. The air carried the smell of turned earth and standing water, and the faint sweetness of the reed thatch on the duck house roof. She had hung the empty egg basket on its peg and come back outside without quite deciding to. He was already there, standing at the edge of the pond with his hands loose at his sides, watching the water. The ducks moved across it without hurry. 11 of them, the same 11, reading the surface the way they always had, by current, by sound, by the small pressure of moving water against their bodies. They did not drift or circle in confusion. They moved with the kind of ease that looked, from a distance, like trust. She came to stand beside him. Neither of them spoke for a time. The pond was still enough in the places they didn't occupy to hold the last of the sky, and the ducks crossed that reflection like they belonged in both worlds at once. He said it quietly, not as a conclusion, but as something he had been turning over and had finally found the words for. He said the birds never needed eyes, that they always knew where home was. She stood with that for a moment. The pond, the mud and sod berm that had taken them 4 days to shape right, the sluice they had rebuilt twice before it held, the channel running north to the garden, where the last of the beets were in the ground, and the orchard row stood in its bare, patient line of young trees. She thought about the auction yard, and the laughing, and the $40 laid out on a weathered rail. She thought about the cracked corner of the northwest pasture, and the way they had looked at it, really looked, because they had nothing left to lose by looking. She thought about 2 people on a flat piece of dry ground, holding a spade between them, deciding to trust what they did not yet understand. She said she supposed that was true of more than just the ducks. He didn't answer, but she felt him shift his weight beside her, the way he did when something landed exactly right and he had no argument with it. The last of the light went off the water. The ducks settled, a few quiet sounds, a brief turning and resettling, and then the pond went still and dark, and theirs. Somewhere behind them, the grass moved in a thin wind. The land lay open all around, the same 160 acres it had always been, and they stood at the edge of what they had made of it, together, and it was enough.